the year 1095, the world was not yet one. It was a collection of kingdoms and caliphates, of deserts and river valleys, of men who had never seen the sea, and men who had never left it. The roads between Europe and the Holy Land were long, and they were dangerous, and most people who lived and died in that century would never travel them. And yet, within just a few years of a single speech delivered on a cold autumn afternoon in the French countryside, hundreds of thousands of people, farmers, knights, priests, noblewomen, children, the desperate and the devout, would set out on foot and on horseback across thousands of miles of unfamiliar terrain, toward a city most of them had only ever heard of in prayer. That city was Jerusalem. And this is the story of how they came to march toward it. It begins, as so many of history's great upheavals do, quietly. Pope Urban II, a calm and measured man by the standards of his era, had called a council at Clermont, in what is now central France. The agenda was largely administrative: church reform, local disputes, the ordinary business of running an institution that stretched across most of the known Western world. But on the 27th of November, 1095, Urban stepped outside to address the gathered crowd, and what he said there would set the next 2 centuries of history into motion. He told them that the Holy Land, the land where Christ had walked, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre still stood, was in the hands of those he called enemies of God. He told them that pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem were being harassed, robbed, sometimes killed. He told them that their brothers in the East, the Byzantine Christians of Constantinople, were under threat from Turkish armies pressing in from the south and east. And then he offered them something extraordinary. He offered them absolution. He told the crowd that any man who took up this cause, who left his home, his family, his fields, and marched to reclaim Jerusalem, would be forgiven his sins. Entirely, completely, as if they had never happened at all. The crowd's response, recorded by those who were there, was simple and immediate. Deus vult. God wills it. What followed was unlike anything Europe had seen before, or perhaps since. The response to Urban's call was not a neat mobilization of professional armies. It was something far more human, far more complicated, and in many ways far more haunting. Ordinary people. People with no military training, no maps, no supply chains, sewed crosses of red cloth onto their tunics and began to walk. They walked out of their villages in France, in Germany, in the Low Countries. They walked through Hungary and Bulgaria, through lands whose rulers had not been consulted and were not pleased. Some sold everything they owned to fund the journey. Some gave away nothing because they had nothing to give. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Some believed with complete sincerity that God would provide food and water along the way. Some of them starved. This first wave, history would call the People's Crusade. It was led not by a king or a duke, but by a charismatic wandering preacher named Peter the Hermit, a small, barefoot man who rode a donkey and possessed, apparently, a remarkable gift for making people believe that the impossible was merely difficult. He gathered tens of thousands of followers across the Rhine Valley and marched them east. Most of them would not survive to see Jerusalem, but they went. Behind them came the princes, the organized military expedition. What historians now call the First Crusade proper was a different kind of enterprise. It was led by some of the most powerful lords of Western Europe. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, a man of striking physical presence and unshakable religious conviction. Raymond of Toulouse, old and half-blind in one eye, who sold his lands before departing because he did not intend to return. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer from southern Italy, who some historians believe joined the crusade as much for territory as for theology. and who was, by most accounts, the finest battlefield commander the campaign would produce. Robert of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, who pawned his duchy to his brother to raise funds for the journey, and with them came thousands of knights, foot soldiers, servants, clergy, and the families who refused to be left behind. They set out in the summer and autumn of 1096. They would not reach Jerusalem until the summer of 1099, and the road between those two dates, 3 years of siege and starvation, of political betrayal and unlikely miracle, of sickness and sand and rivers of blood beneath the walls of cities, is one of the most extraordinary journeys in recorded human history. This is that journey, told slowly, told completely. Come and walk it with us. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a village after its men have gone to war. The tools left leaning against walls, the fields that will need tending by hands not accustomed to the work, the children who will ask for months when their fathers are coming home. In the autumn and winter of 1096, that silence fell across thousands of villages stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the banks of the Rhine, and it fell, in many cases, before anyone in those villages fully understood what they had agreed to, because the decision to go, for many of the men who made it, had not been rational. It had been felt. It had moved through them the way music moves through a room, the way a sermon catches fire on a particular Sunday morning when the air is cold and the congregation is hungry for something larger than their ordinary lives. They had heard the call, or heard someone describing the call, or heard someone describing someone else who had heard it, and they had simply begun to prepare. This is worth pausing on, because one of the most misunderstood things about the Crusades, and about the First Crusade in particular, is the question of motivation. Later centuries would look back on this event and try to find a single, clean explanation. They were after land, some would say. They were after wealth. They were pawns of the Pope, moved around a political chessboard by men with agendas. And there is truth in all of these readings, but they are incomplete truths, because the evidence, the letters, the chronicles, the account books, the sermons preserved in monastery libraries across Europe, suggests something more tangled and more human. Many of the men who took the cross in 1096 genuinely believed they were doing the most important thing a person could do. They believed that Jerusalem was the center of the world. Literally, on the maps of the period, Jerusalem often appears at the center of the known earth, and that its liberation was a sacred duty of the First Order. They believed that their sins, which in the moral framework of the time were a source of genuine, visceral terror, could be washed clean by this act of sacrifice. Death on the road to Jerusalem was not death. It was martyrdom. It was a door held open. That belief was not cynical. For most of the people who held it, it was the realest thing in their lives. The recruitment for the First Crusade did not look like modern conscription. There were no lists, no registries, no uniforms pressed and waiting. What there were preachers. Urban II had not only delivered his speech at Clermont and waited for results, he had set in motion a vast network of itinerant clergy, wandering priests and monks who fanned out across France, across the German-speaking lands, across the Italian peninsula, carrying the message from market town to market town, from cathedral to village church to open field. They preached in Latin to those who understood it, and in the local vernacular to those who did not. They described the suffering of pilgrims in the East. They described the holy sites, the tomb of Christ, the place of the Nativity, the road Christ had walked carrying the cross, in the hands of those they called desecrators. They wept openly at the pulpits. They called on the assembled crowds to act, and the crowds responded. The most remarkable of these preachers, and the one who would generate the most immediate and chaotic response, was the man already mentioned, Peter the Hermit. He was not an obviously imposing figure. Contemporary descriptions suggest a lean, weathered man, poorly dressed, with an intensity in his eyes that people seemed to find difficult to look away from. He had reportedly attempted a pilgrimage to Jerusalem himself in the years before the Crusade, and had been turned back, mistreated, humiliated, forced to return to Europe without reaching his destination. Whatever the full truth of that story, he carried it with him like a wound, and when he preached, people could feel it. He moved through the Rhineland and northern France like a slow tide, and the people came to him. Not just knights, not just young men looking for adventure. Families came, elderly pilgrims came, peasants who owned nothing but the clothes on their backs came. They attached themselves to his procession and marched with him, and the procession grew and kept growing until it numbered somewhere between 20 and 40,000 souls. Historians debate the precise figure, and the sources are not always reliable, but the scale is not in doubt. It was enormous. It was unprecedented. And it was almost completely unprepared. Peter's army, if it can be called that, had no meaningful supply chain. It had no siegecraft. It had no experienced military commanders in any real sense. What it had was faith and numbers and a destination, and it departed for the east in the spring of 1096, months ahead of the organized noble contingents, moving through Germany and into the Hungarian kingdom of King Koloman, a man who was, initially, willing to let them pass, provided they behaved themselves. They did not always behave themselves. The journey through Hungary was the first sign of what this enterprise would actually cost. Some of the crusading groups, not Peter's directly, but associated contingents moving through the same corridor, began to raid local villages when their food ran out. Tensions with Hungarian border guards escalated into violence. One group, led by a minor German lord named Amicho of Flonheim, never made it past Hungary at all. Koloman's forces intercepted and destroyed them near the river Sava, and that was the end of their crusade before it had properly begun. But more disturbing and more historically significant was what some of these same groups did before they ever reached Hungary. In the spring of 1096, as the People's Crusade assembled and moved east through the Rhineland, the densely populated valley of the Rhine River, home to some of the oldest and most established Jewish communities in Europe, a wave of violence erupted against those communities that stands as one of the darkest chapters of the entire crusading era. The city of Worms, the city of Mainz, Cologne, Trier. In each of these places, mobs, sometimes acting independently of any military leadership, sometimes with the tacit or explicit participation of local crusading forces, turned on their Jewish neighbors with catastrophic results. The reasoning, such as it was, ran like this. If the Crusaders were marching to fight enemies of Christ in the East, why leave enemies of Christ, as they framed it, with grotesque and murderous distortion, living peacefully among them in the West? It was a logic of persecution dressed up as theology, and it unleashed carnage. Thousands of people were killed. Communities that had existed for generations were annihilated. Some chose death by their own hand rather than forced conversion. Bishops in several cities attempted to shelter Jewish residents within their walls and were only partially successful. These massacres, known in Jewish historical memory as the Rheinfleisch persecutions, or more broadly as part of the Gezerot, the persecutions of 1096, were not ordered by the Pope. Urban II had not called for violence against Jewish people, but he had called for holy war, and holy war, once ignited, does not always burn where it is pointed. This is one of the first and most sobering lessons of the First Crusade, and it deserves to be stated plainly, without softening. Peter the Hermit's main body, somewhat more disciplined than the splinter groups, moved through Hungary without catastrophic incident and crossed into Byzantine territory. The Eastern Empire of Constantinople. In the early summer of 1096, the Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, had originally sent a request to the Pope for military assistance. He had wanted mercenaries, or trained soldiers, or some organized military force to help him hold back the Seljuk Turks pressing against his eastern borders. What arrived instead was Peter the Hermit and 40,000 desperate pilgrims. Alexios was, by all accounts, a capable and pragmatic ruler. He looked at Peter's army, assessed its fighting capacity, assessed the damage it was already doing to Byzantine markets and supply lines simply by existing and needing to eat, and made a swift decision. He fed them, resupplied them as best he could, and moved them across the Bosphorus, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, as quickly as possible. He urged them, with considerable diplomatic tact, to wait for the professional armies he knew were coming behind them before advancing further. Peter's crusaders did not wait. They pushed into Anatolia, the great plateau of what is now Turkey, and found themselves in territory actively contested by Seljuk forces under the Sultanate of Rum. The Turks were professional soldiers. They were fighting on familiar ground. They had cavalry that could move faster than any infantry column, archers on horseback who could strike and vanish before a line of foot soldiers could respond. The Crusaders had numbers and courage and essentially nothing else. The result was the battle, or more accurately, the slaughter, of Sivetot. In October of 1096, a large Crusader column walked into an ambush in a narrow valley and was nearly wiped out. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were captured and enslaved. Peter the Hermit, who had been back in Constantinople at the time seeking further aid, returned to find his army destroyed. The People's Crusade was over, but behind it, moving more slowly, organizing more deliberately, and carrying with them the weight of genuine military power. The princes and their armies were already on the road, and they would not make the same mistakes. There is something quietly remarkable about the autumn of 1096. Across 4 separate routes, departing from 4 separate corners of Western Europe, the great noble contingents of the First Crusade began their march east, each army independent, each lord commanding his own men, each column moving at its own pace through its own corridor of territory. They had no shared radio, no coordinating general staff, no single chain of command. And yet, by the spring of 1097, almost all of them would arrive at the same place, within weeks of one another, as if drawn by a current none of them could see. That place was Constantinople, and their arrival there would be one of the most charged and complicated diplomatic moments of the medieval world. To understand what happened when the Crusaders reached the Byzantine capital, it helps to understand what Constantinople was, not as an idea, not as a symbol, but as a physical place in the world of 1096. It was, quite simply, the greatest city most of these men had ever seen. Western Europe in the late 11th century was a place of modest urban life. Its largest cities, Paris, London, Cologne, were small and rough by any comparative standard. They had markets and cathedrals and city walls, but they did not have running water carried through stone aqueducts. They did not have libraries holding hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. They did not have palaces whose floors were laid with porphyry and gold mosaic, whose throne rooms were designed to make visiting dignitaries feel, deliberately and precisely, as though they had entered another order of existence entirely. Constantinople had all of this, and more. It had a population that may have reached 400,000 people, at a time when London held perhaps 15,000. It had been the capital of the Roman Empire in the East for 7 centuries. It had walls that had held against invaders again and again across those centuries, walls so formidable that military engineers in the medieval world spoke of them the way later generations would speak of natural features, mountains, oceans, things you planned around rather than through. When the crusading armies arrived at the gates of this city, footsore and road-worn and still months away from their destination, the culture shock must have been profound, and it ran in both directions. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had, as previously noted, invited this situation, in the sense that his appeal to Pope Urban II had helped set the crusade in motion, but he had not invited quite this. He had imagined something manageable. What appeared outside his walls was an armed force of perhaps 60 to 80,000 soldiers, accompanied by an indeterminate number of non-combatants, all of them needing to be fed, housed, watered, and kept from pillaging the surrounding countryside while negotiations proceeded. Alexios was an exceptional political operator. The historian Anna Komnene, his daughter, who would later write a detailed account of her father's reign called the Alexiad, describes him as a man who could read people with unsettling precision, who knew when to flatter and when to threaten, and who almost never let his actual feelings show on his face. He would need all of that skill in the months ahead. His fundamental problem was this: the Crusaders were, in theory, there to help him. They were going to march through his territory, fight his enemies, and potentially recover lands that had once been Byzantine. But they were not his soldiers. They did not answer to him. They had their own leaders, their own ambitions, and their own ideas about what should happen to any territory they happened to conquer along the way. And some of those leaders, Bohemond of Taranto in particular, Alexios knew from direct personal experience. He had fought Bohemond before in a different context, on a different front. He did not entirely trust him. He was probably right not to. So Alexios did what skilled emperors do. He negotiated, one by one. As each noble contingent arrived at Constantinople, Alexios invited their leaders into the palace and presented them with what he wanted: an oath. Specifically, an oath that any lands recovered from the Turks, lands that had previously been Byzantine, would be returned to the empire, not kept by the crusading lords as their own possessions. In exchange, he offered them guides, supplies, intelligence about the terrain ahead, and the logistical support of the Byzantine military apparatus. It was, on paper, a reasonable exchange. In practice, it was the source of tensions that would never fully resolve, and that would eventually poison the relationship between Crusaders and Byzantines for generations to come. Most of the lords took the oath, some more willingly than others. Raymond of Toulouse, old and proud and deeply pious, initially refused. Not out of ambition for Byzantine lands, but out of principle. He had already sworn an oath to no earthly lord other than the Pope, and he was reluctant to complicate that. Eventually, a modified form of words was found that satisfied everyone's honor, at least on the surface. Godfrey of Bouillon, after an early and somewhat embarrassing episode in which his troops clashed with Byzantine forces outside the city walls, also swore. Even Bohemond, smiling, charming, privately calculating, swore. And then, with the oaths given and the supplies distributed, Alexios moved them across the Bosphorus. He fed them across the strait in ships and watched them go, and then sat in his palace and wondered, one imagines, what exactly he had set in motion. The army that assembled on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus in the spring of 1097 was a genuinely formidable thing. The chaos of the People's Crusade was behind them. What stood in Anatolia now was an organized military force with experienced cavalry, trained infantry, siege engineers, and enough internal hierarchy to function as a coherent fighting unit. Most of the time, with occasional exceptions when the lords' competing egos produced paralysis, which happened more than anyone would later like to admit. Their first objective was Nicaea. Nicaea, present-day Synik in northwestern Turkey, was a city of enormous symbolic and strategic importance. It had been the site of the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where the foundational creed of Christian doctrine had been formulated. More immediately relevant, it was the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, and it sat directly across the Crusaders' route of march. They could not go around it. It had to be taken. The siege of Nicaea began in May of 1097, and it introduced the crusading army to several realities of warfare in this part of the world that would define the entire campaign ahead. The first was the quality of the enemy. The Seljuk Turks were not the disorganized rabble that crusading propaganda sometimes implied. They were disciplined, experienced fighters with a sophisticated understanding of cavalry tactics, fortification, and the use of terrain. The Sultan of Rum, Kilij Arslan, had initially underestimated the Crusaders. He had, after all, watched Peter the Hermit's army dissolve in Anatolia just months earlier and drawn reasonable conclusions. When he realized his mistake and rode back to relieve Nicaea with a substantial force, the Crusaders met him in the field and repulsed him. It was the first real pitched battle of the campaign, and it announced clearly that this was a different kind of army than the one he had destroyed at Sivetote. The second reality was the role of the lake. Nicaea sat on the eastern shore of Lake Ascanius, and its defenders were using that lake to resupply the city by boat, rendering the land siege incomplete. The Crusaders, with typical adaptability, solved this by asking Alexios for a fleet of small vessels, which were transported overland on wagons and launched onto the lake. It was a logistical feat of some ingenuity, and it worked. The city's supply line was cut, but in the end, Nicaea did not fall to a Crusader assault. It was surrendered, quietly, carefully, and with exquisite Byzantine timing, directly to Alexios's representatives, who negotiated with the garrison while the Crusaders slept. The city's defenders slipped out, the Byzantine flag went up, and when the crusading lords arrived expecting to enter a conquered city, they found imperial officers already in place and the garrison already under Byzantine protection. Some of the Crusaders were furious. They had besieged this city. They had bled for it. And now it had been handed, intact and unlooted, to the emperor who was supposed to be their ally. Alexios, to his credit, sent generous gifts and kind words. He was doing exactly what a Byzantine emperor was supposed to do, protecting imperial interests, recovering imperial territory, spending as little Byzantine blood as possible in the process. But the trust between the Crusaders and Constantinople had developed its first fracture. It would widen in the months ahead into something that could not be repaired. The road south from Nicaea was open, and the army moved on. There is a particular kind of suffering that has no single dramatic moment, no battle to point to, no enemy to name. It accumulates slowly, degree by degree, mile by mile, in the body and the mind, until men who began the journey upright and purposeful are walking with their heads down, putting one foot in front of the other, not because they believe in where they are going, but because stopping seems worse. That is what Anatolia did to the First Crusade. The army that marched south from Nicaea in late June of 1097 was, on paper, the strongest force Western Europe had assembled in living memory. It had won its first engagement. It had taken its first city. It had the logistical support, however complicated, of the Byzantine Empire at its back. The men were lean from the road but hardened by it. The horses were watered. The supply wagons were loaded, and the summer lay ahead, long and bright and, as the Crusaders were about to discover, absolutely merciless. Anatolia in high summer is not a landscape that forgives. The central plateau stretches for hundreds of miles, and it is a place of extremes. In winter it is bitter and snowbound. In summer, the heat presses down from a sky that offers almost no shade, reflecting upward from pale stone and dry earth. And the rivers and streams that might sustain an army shrink to trickles or vanish entirely. The Crusaders had crossed into a world their bodies did not know. Men raised in the green and temperate valleys of France and the Low Countries, accustomed to rain and mild summers and the steady proximity of water, found themselves walking through a kiln. But before the slow suffering of the plateau could begin in earnest, there was a battle to survive. 6 days out of Nicaea, at a place the sources call Dorylaeum, a wide valley in the northwestern reaches of the plateau, the army of the First Crusade came within reach of being destroyed. Kilij Arslan had not given up. Humiliated at Nicaea, he had been gathering forces, calling in allies, assembling a cavalry army substantially larger than what he had brought to the first engagement. And his strategy this time was different. He would not meet the Crusaders in a straightforward engagement. He would use what he had and what they lacked: speed. The crusading army was divided, as it marched, into 2 columns separated by several miles. Bohemond of Taranto commanded the vanguard, the forward group, and it was this column that Kilij Arslan struck first in the early morning hours of the first day of July, 1097. The Turks came out of the hills on horseback, and they came in a way that European knights had not encountered before and were not prepared for. The standard engagement that a Western knight understood and had trained his entire life to execute involved 2 lines of armored cavalry meeting at a gallop, lances lowered, the shock of impact deciding the encounter in moments. It was brutal and effective against opponents who fought the same way. Against the Turkish cavalry it was nearly useless. The Seljuk horsemen did not close. They circled. They released arrows at range, from horseback, at full gallop, twisting in the saddle to fire behind them as they retreated. And when the Crusader knights charged, they simply opened up and flowed around the charge like water around a stone and resumed shooting from the flanks. It was the mounted archer, the horse archer, and the Crusaders had no answer for it. Not yet. Bohemond's vanguard was pinned. Men and horses were being killed at range, and there was nothing to hit back at. Bohemond made the correct decision, the only decision available, and ordered his forces to hold a defensive perimeter, dismount, and wait. He sent riders back to the main column at a full gallop with one message: "Come now." What followed was hours of desperate endurance. The Turks pressed from all sides. The heat was already building. Water was running low inside the Crusader perimeter. Men were dying, and still the main column had not arrived. When it did arrive, when the banners of Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon came over the ridge, and the full weight of the crusading army hit the Turkish flank, the battle turned with remarkable speed. The Turks, who had been managing a contained target, suddenly found themselves flanked and outnumbered, and they broke. The retreat was swift. The pursuit was limited because the Crusader horses were exhausted, but the field was held. Dorylaeum was the first true battle of the First Crusade, and it taught both sides something important. The Turks learned that this army would not dissolve under pressure the way Peter's pilgrims had. The Crusaders learned that they were fighting an enemy whose methods were entirely unlike anything their training had prepared them for, and that learning to adapt was not optional, it was survival. After Dorylaeum, the real ordeal began. The army pushed south and east across the Anatolian plateau through the height of summer, and the plateau took its toll with quiet, relentless efficiency. The water sources marked on Byzantine maps were not always where the map said they were. The supply wagons, heavy and slow, could not always keep pace with the march. The horses, the foundation of Crusader military power, began to die, not in battle. From thirst and heat, and the cumulative exhaustion of weeks of marching on poor forage, knights who'd crossed Europe on horseback found themselves walking, leading animals too weak to carry them, or standing at the side of the road watching a horse they had owned for years sink to its knees and not rise again. Dogs traveled with the army, as they always did, pack animals, companions, the ordinary creatures of a military camp, and they too began to die. One chronicler records seeing knights so desperate for a mount that they loaded their equipment onto oxen and rode them, slowly and with great indignity, across the plateau. It is a strangely human detail in an account full of violence and grandeur. The proud Norman knight, armed and armored and astride a plodding ox, inching across the Turkish highlands toward the holy city of Jerusalem. History does not always look the way we imagine it. The non-combatants suffered worst of all. The camp followers, the pilgrims, the servants, the women who had refused to be left behind, had no military rations, no priority at the water points, no protection from the sun beyond whatever cloth they could arrange over their heads. They died in numbers that the chronicles note and then move past, because the chronicles were written by and for the powerful, and the deaths of the powerless were recorded as texture rather than tragedy. We do not know their names. We know that they walked, and that many of them did not finish walking. And through all of it, the army kept moving. What kept them going is a question worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not a simple question. The obvious answer is faith, and faith was certainly present, sustaining men in the way that genuine belief can sustain people through almost anything. But faith alone does not explain it entirely, because there were also practical mechanisms at work. The lords pushed their men, social structure, hierarchy, the obligation of a fighting man to his lord. These were not abstractions in the medieval world. They were the operating system of daily life. A foot soldier did not simply decide to stop marching because he was exhausted. He marched because his lord expected it, because his companions were marching, because the consequences of desertion, social, practical, spiritual, were real and immediate. And desertion did happen. Some men slipped away from the column in the night and tried to find their way back west. Some succeeded. Most, probably, did not. The plateau was not survivable alone. There was also, threading through the army like a rumor that refused to die, a persistent sense that they were being watched over, that the suffering was purposeful, that God was testing them, as God, in their understanding, always tested those he loved best, and that on the other side of the testing was something worth all of it. Every hardship became, in this reading, a kind of proof. The worse it was, the more certain some of them felt that they were on the right road. It is a strange thing, that logic, and it is worth neither mocking it nor romanticizing it. It was simply true of them, the way other things are simply true of other people in other times. They believed, and the belief carried them forward when nothing else could. By autumn of 1097, battered, depleted, their cavalry reduced to a fraction of what it had been, the army descended from the plateau into the greener, more forgiving terrain of northern Syria. The city of Antioch rose before them, ancient, massive, its walls climbing the steep slopes of Mount Silpius like a stone tide frozen in place. They looked at it, they assessed it, and they began, with the weary determination of people who had run out of the ability to be surprised by difficulty, to prepare for a siege. If you wanted to design a city that could not be taken, you might arrive at something close to Antioch. It sat where the Orontes River curved through a narrow valley in what is now southern Turkey, just north of the Syrian border, and it had been built by people who understood, deeply and practically, the relationship between geography and survival. Its walls ran for 12 miles. 12 miles of dressed stone, reinforced with towers. Some accounts say nearly 400 towers, climbing from the valley floor up the sheer face of Mount Silpius and along the ridge above, so that the city's highest fortifications looked down on everything around them from an angle that made assault essentially suicidal. It had multiple gates, each one a fortress within a fortress. It had water from the river. It had granaries that, fully stocked, could sustain the population for months. The Crusaders arrived before it in October of 1097, after nearly a year on the road, And what they felt when they looked at those walls must have contained, alongside whatever resolve they carried, a very human and very honest flicker of despair. They settled in to besiege it anyway. The siege of Antioch would last 7.5 months. It would become, in the memory of those who survived it, something separate from the rest of the crusade, its own contained world of suffering and strangeness, of hunger and hallucination, of politics conducted in tent cities outside walls that refused to fall. It was the chapter of the First Crusade that most fully revealed the character of the people involved, because character, as it tends to, emerged most clearly under the most sustained and unrelenting pressure. The first problem was the most basic one. The Crusaders could not surround Antioch completely. The city was simply too large and the army too small to encircle 12 miles of wall. This meant that the garrison could resupply through the gates the Crusaders could not cover, receiving food, reinforcements, and intelligence about Crusader movements with relative ease. The besiegers found themselves, almost immediately, in the paradoxical position of laying siege to a city that was better supplied than they were. And so the hunger began. Not the sharp, dramatic hunger of a single desperate day, but the grinding, chronic hunger of weeks and then months without enough. The supply lines back through Anatolia were long and vulnerable. The surrounding countryside had been stripped by the time the army arrived, either by the army itself or by locals who had seen armies coming and acted accordingly. Foraging parties sent out from the siege lines came back with less each time, and sometimes did not come back at all, picked off by Turkish cavalry operating in the hills around the valley. Men began to eat their horses, same horses they had walked beside across the Anatolian plateau, the animals that represented both military capacity and, in many cases, a kind of companionship forged on the long road from Europe. They ate them because there was nothing else, and when the horses were gone, the military power of the crusading army, already reduced by the crossing of Anatolia, was reduced again, dramatically, to something close to a defensive force. Knights fought on foot. The proud, heavy cavalry of France and Normandy stood in the mud of the Orontes Valley and went hungry. Desertions accelerated. Men slipped away in the night with whatever they could carry. Some of the desertions were quietly shameful. A lesser lord, a minor knight, someone whose absence could be overlooked. But some were not quiet at all. Stephen of Blois, one of the more senior lords on the expedition, left the siege in February of 1098, citing illness, and made his way back toward Constantinople. He would later write a letter to his wife describing the siege as going splendidly, which was either a remarkable act of self-deception or a calculated piece of fiction designed to manage her expectations. Either way, it did not age well. Outside the walls, meanwhile, the strategic situation was deteriorating. Word had reached the Muslim rulers of Syria and Mesopotamia that a large Christian army was sitting, increasingly weak and vulnerable, in the valley of the Orontes. A relief force was being assembled. Its commander was Kaboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, a powerful and experienced military leader whose army, when it finally arrived, would substantially outnumber the Crusaders. The calculus of the siege was shifting. The Crusaders did not simply need to take Antioch. They needed to take it before Kaboga arrived, or they would find themselves trapped between the city's garrison and a fresh army at their backs. It was at this precise moment, with hunger gnawing, desertion rising, Kaboga approaching, and the walls as impenetrable as ever, that a Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew came to the attention of the crusading leadership with a remarkable claim. He had been having visions. In these visions, St. Andrew, the apostle, had appeared to him and had told him something specific and verifiable, that the lance that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, the Holy Lance, one of the most sacred relics in Christendom, was buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter inside Antioch. If the Crusaders could find it, St. Andrew had apparently told Peter Bartholomew they would have the strength to prevail. The reaction among the crusading leadership was divided. Some were skeptical, politely or otherwise. The papal legate, Adhemar of Le Puy, a careful and intelligent man who had served as the spiritual authority of the expedition since its departure, was notably cool toward Peter Bartholomew and his visions. Others, Raymond of Toulouse among them, were more receptive. Raymond was a deeply emotional Christian who had already demonstrated, at several points in the journey, a genuine and uncomplicated piety that his more calculating peers sometimes lacked. He believed, or at least he chose to believe. And then the city fell, not through the lance, but through a betrayal. Inside Antioch, a man named Firuz, a captain in command of one of the towers along the southern wall, a man who had converted from Christianity to Islam, and who had, apparently, developed grievances against the garrison's leadership serious enough to overcome his loyalties, made contact with Bohemond of Taranto. The negotiations were conducted in secret over several weeks, and the offer was simple. On a designated night, Firuz would open his tower. Bohemond's men would climb the walls on ladders, and Antioch would be taken from within. Bohemond brought the intelligence to the other lords with a condition attached. He would share what he knew, but in exchange he wanted the other leaders to agree, in advance, that if Antioch was taken using his information, the city would be his. His to rule, his to hold, his, implicitly, to keep, regardless of what had been promised to Alexios back in Constantinople. The other lords argued. They hesitated, and then word arrived that Kerboga's advance forces had been sighted moving into the region, and the argument became academic. They agreed to Bohemond's terms on the night of June the 2nd, 1098. In the darkness before dawn, the Crusaders crept silently along the base of the southern wall to the tower of Firuz. Ladders went up. The first men climbed. The tower was opened from within, and then the Crusaders poured into Antioch like a tide that had finally found its breach. And what followed was the kind of close-quarters violence that medieval warfare, at its most terrible, could produce. By morning, Antioch was in Crusader hands. Most of the garrison was dead. The citadel, high on Mount Silpius, still held. A Turkish force remained there, unreachable and defiant, but the city below it belonged to the Crusade. 3 days later, Kerboga's army arrived and surrounded them. The irony was almost elegant. The Crusaders had besieged Antioch for 7.5 months. They had taken it in a single night, and within days they were themselves besieged inside it by an army larger than their own, with the citadel still hostile above them and their supplies already stripped from the siege. The hunters had become the hunted. The besiegers were now the besieged. And it was now, in this moment of maximum desperation, that Peter Bartholomew's vision became something more than a rumor. Digging began beneath the floor of the cathedral. Raymond's men, mostly, true believers with mattocks and faith. For hours they found nothing. And then, at a depth that the sources argue about, one of the diggers struck something, a length of iron, old, corroded, undeniably ancient. The Holy Lance, they said, the spear of Longinus, found exactly where the vision had promised. Whether it was genuine, whether that corroded fragment of iron was truly the weapon that had pierced the side of Christ, is a question that was contested even then and cannot be answered now. What mattered in the valley of the Orontes in June of 1098 was not the relic's authenticity. What mattered was what it did to the men who held it. They marched out of Antioch's gates on the 28th of June, carrying the lance at the front of their column to face Kerboga's army in the open field. Starving, outnumbered, on foot, most of them, because the horses were long gone. And somehow, against every rational calculation of military probability, they won. There is a moment in the life of any great endeavor that has gone on long enough where the people involved stop being able to remember clearly what it felt like before it began. The Crusaders who marched south from Antioch in the winter and spring of 1099 were not the same people who had knelt in the fields of France and Germany and sewn red crosses onto their tunics 3 years earlier. They had been changed in ways that do not fully translate into words, changed by the road, by the hunger, by the dead they had left behind in the Anatolian dust and the Syrian mud, by the particular alteration that comes over human beings when they have survived things they were not certain they would survive. They were fewer now, substantially fewer. The army that had crossed the Bosphorus in 1097 numbered somewhere in the range of 60 to 70,000 combatants. The force that finally departed Antioch for Jerusalem in January of 1099 was perhaps a third of that, possibly less. Disease, battle, desertion, and the ordinary attrition of 3 years on the road had taken the rest. The horses were almost entirely gone. The great lords, Bohemond, who stayed behind in Antioch to claim his prize, Stephen of Blois, who had fled the siege and would spend years living with the shame of it, had thinned the leadership as well. What remained was a core, hardened, diminished, and still moving south. Raymond of Toulouse led the march. Old Raymond, half-blind, who had sold everything before leaving because he did not intend to return. He was still here, still walking. The journey south through Syria and along the Palestinian coast was different in character from anything the Crusaders had experienced before it. The worst of the open resistance had, for the moment, subsided. The Seljuk Turks who had contested Anatolia were not the power here. The Fatimid Caliphate, based in Egypt, controlled Jerusalem and the surrounding region, and they had actually been negotiating with the Crusaders during the siege of Antioch, at one point offering to allow Christian pilgrims free access to Jerusalem if the Crusaders would simply stop advancing. The Crusaders declined. Jerusalem was not a pilgrimage goal anymore. It was a military objective. The Fatimids, reading the situation correctly, had recently retaken Jerusalem from a Seljuk garrison, making it, technically, newly under different Muslim rule when the Crusaders arrived. This detail matters less than it might seem. What mattered to the Crusaders was the city's name, its stones, its gates, the tomb beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which in their understanding held the promise of everything they had endured to reach it. Many of the coastal cities the army passed through made pragmatic decisions. Tripoli, Beirut, Sidon, Acre. Their rulers sent out food, supplies, and diplomatic assurances of non-interference. They had watched what happened at Antioch. They were not eager to test these gaunt, ferocious, apparently unstoppable Europeans in a siege. The army moved through their territories like a weather system, acknowledged and accommodated, and pressed on. The march had a quality of unreality to it that the chroniclers, in their various ways, all try to capture. These men were approaching the end of something enormous. They had lived inside this journey for so long that the destination had taken on a mythic weight that no actual physical city could entirely bear. Jerusalem existed, in their minds, simultaneously as a real place made of stone and mortar, and inhabited by real people, and as a symbol so laden with meaning that simply pronouncing its name in prayer had sustained them through things that should have broken them. The closer they got, the more these two versions of the city pressed against each other. They came within sight of Jerusalem on the 7th of June, 1099. The chronicles record what happened next with a consistency that is itself moving. Men wept, not quietly, not privately, but openly and without embarrassment. Knights, foot soldiers, priests, the few women still traveling with the army. Some fell to their knees in the road. Some removed their shoes, as Moses had removed his at the burning bush. because the ground beneath their feet was holy ground, and they knew it, and they felt it with their whole bodies. They had walked, in some cases literally walked, from France or Germany or southern Italy, across more than 2,000 miles of road and mountain and desert and plateau, and the city was there, actually there. Real walls, real towers, real gates shimmering in the June heat of the Palestinian highlands. Raymond of Toulouse, by several accounts, could not speak. Jerusalem in 1099 was formidably defended. The Fatimid governor, a man named Iftikhar ad-Dawla, had prepared carefully for the Crusaders' arrival. He had expelled the Christian population of the city, removing a potential fifth column, and had poisoned or blocked the wells outside the walls to deny water to a besieging army. The walls themselves were ancient and solid, reinforced in recent years, and the garrison was well armed and supplied. Iftikhar had sent word to Egypt requesting relief, and he had reason to expect it would come. The Fatimid Caliphate was a major power. It had armies. He needed to hold the city long enough for those armies to arrive. The Crusaders were once again in a race against a relief force they could not see. But the immediate problem was not the garrison, it was thirst. The wells were poisoned. The streams around the city were inadequate for an army. The summer heat of Jerusalem, higher elevation than the coast, but still ferociously hot in June and July, pressed down on men already worn to their limits. The army sent out desperate foraging parties searching for water across miles of sun-baked limestone hills. Cisterns were found, small and brackish. It was not enough, and without siege equipment, the walls were untouchable. The first, somewhat disorganized assault on the city, launched in mid-June out of impatience and desperation, failed completely. The Crusaders had ladders, insufficient numbers of them, and nothing else. The garrison beat them back without particular difficulty, and the army retreated to its camps, thirstier and more desperate than before. What saved them arrived by sea. A fleet of Genoese and English ships had put in at the port of Jaffa on the Palestinian coast, carrying not soldiers but something nearly as valuable: timber, ropes, tools, and the craftsmen who knew how to use them. Because Jerusalem, surrounded by bare limestone hills, scoured of trees by centuries of habitation, offered almost nothing in the way of raw materials for siege construction. The timber had to come from somewhere else. Forests were located, eventually, many miles distant. Samaria to the north, areas east of the Jordan, and the army sent out parties to cut and haul wood across miles of difficult terrain in the full heat of a Palestinian summer. The man who organized the construction of the siege equipment was a Genoese engineer named William Ricot, working alongside other craftsmen whose names history has not fully preserved. They built two great siege towers, massive wheeled wooden structures, taller than the walls they were meant to match, designed to be rolled forward until they connected with the battlements and allowed men to cross from tower to wall. They built mangonels, the stone-throwing machines that could batter masonry and suppress defenders. They built a covered ram for one of the gates. The work took weeks, conducted in brutal heat, under constant harassment from the garrison's archers. Raymond positioned his siege tower to the south. Godfrey of Bouillon positioned his to the north, on a stretch of wall near the gate of the column, where a slight depression in the ground brought the tower closer to the battlements than anywhere else. This positioning would matter. It would matter enormously. On the night of the 13th of July, the towers were moved forward under cover of darkness. By morning, they were in position. The assault began. For 2 days, the fighting at the walls was desperate and inconclusive. The garrison fought with everything it had: boiling oil, fire, stones, arrows, the sheer physical violence of men defending something they understood they could not afford to lose. The Crusaders pushed forward and were pushed back and pushed forward again. The siege towers swayed and burned at their edges, and the men inside them climbed and were thrown down, and others climbed behind them. And then, on the afternoon of the 15th of July, 199, a Friday, the day of the crucifixion, which the more theologically minded among the Crusaders would note with awe, a knight named Letold of Tournai became the first Crusader to step from Godfrey's siege tower onto the wall of Jerusalem. He was followed immediately by his brother, then by Godfrey himself, then by the men behind him. The wall was breached, the gates were opened from within, and the army of the First Crusade entered Jerusalem. What happened next in the streets of that city is a story that belongs to the final segment, the ending that explains why the First Crusade remains, nearly 1,000 years later, one of the most contested and consequential events in human history. The city was taken, but the taking was not the end of the story. It was, in many ways, only the beginning of what the world would have to reckon with. What happened inside Jerusalem on the 15th of July, 1099, has been written about, argued over, and mourned for nearly 1,000 years. It deserves to be stated honestly, without the softening that distance sometimes tempts us toward. The Crusaders killed the people they found inside the city. Not all of them. Some were ransomed, some were spared by individual lords who extended personal protection, but many. The Jewish community, who had fought alongside the Muslim garrison, perished almost entirely. The slaughter ran through the streets for the better part of 2 days, and when it was done, the city that 3 faiths called holy was soaked in the blood of the people who had been living in it when the walls came down. The chroniclers who recorded this, men who had made the journey, who had suffered through Anatolia and Antioch and the waterless hills outside Jerusalem, described it with a complicated mixture of horror and triumph that they themselves did not seem fully able to untangle. Some wrote of the blood in the streets as evidence of God's righteous judgment. Others went quieter, recording facts without interpretation, as if the weight of what they had witnessed had used up whatever theological framework they arrived with. Neither response resolves anything, but both are worth knowing. In the days that followed, something quieter descended on the city. The surviving Crusaders moved through the streets they had dreamed of for 3 years, and they visited the places they had crossed a continent to see. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place of the crucifixion, the tomb. Men who had eaten their horses on the Anatolian plateau, who had starved outside Antioch, who had carried the memory of everyone they had lost on the road. These men stood in that church and wept again, as they had wept at the first sight of the walls, but differently now, with something that had no clean name. Godfrey of Bouillon, offered the title of King of Jerusalem, refused it. He would not, he said, wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He took instead the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, and governed what was now the newly established Crusader state, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. With that designation, he would be dead within a year of illness, having spent almost nothing of the time he had sacrificed everything to arrive at. His brother Baldwin would succeed him and take the royal title without Godfrey's theological hesitation. Raymond of Toulouse, who had sold his lands before departing because he did not intend to return, did not stay in Jerusalem. He went north and spent his remaining years carving out territory in the region around Tripoli, and died there in Ellendon 05, never having gone home. He had meant what he said at the beginning. The relief army from Egypt arrived too late. A Fatimid force met the Crusaders at Ascalon on the Palestinian coast just weeks after the fall of Jerusalem, and was defeated. It was the last serious military challenge to the new Crusader presence in the immediate term. The kingdom was established. It would survive, in various forms, for nearly 2 centuries, and the world began to process what had happened. The First Crusade sent ripples outward through history in directions that no one who participated in it could have anticipated, and in some cases could have imagined. It established a Latin Christian presence in the heart of the Islamic world, that generated 200 years of subsequent crusades, some large and organized, some disastrous, some both simultaneously. It deepened the fracture between Eastern and Western Christianity that had been formalized in 1054, because the Crusaders' behavior in Byzantine territory and their refusal to reliably honor their oaths to Alexios made Constantinople's distrust of the West structural rather than situational. That distrust would have consequences, culminating grotesquely in the Fourth Crusade of 1204, when Crusaders sacked Constantinople itself. It set precedents for religiously justified violence that echoed through Western history in ways still being traced by historians today. It transformed the idea of pilgrimage into the idea of holy war. And that transformation did not stay contained to the Holy Land. The logic of crusading was eventually applied to pagans in the Baltic, to heretics in southern France, to political enemies of the papacy in Italy. Once the mechanism existed, it proved remarkably adaptable. And it left its mark on the collective memory of the Islamic world in ways that have never fully faded. The Arabic word for crusader, salabi, from the cross, carried, for centuries afterward, a weight of meaning that went far beyond a historical category. But there is another way to hold the story alongside all of that. A quieter way. Somewhere in northern France, in the autumn of 1096, a man put down his tools, kissed his family, and began to walk. He had never been more than 20 miles from where he was born. He did not know what Anatolia looked like, or how hot a Palestinian summer could be, or what it felt like to be genuinely hungry for months at a time. He knew his village, and his faith, and the name of the city he was walking toward. He probably did not make it. Most of them did not. But he walked, and the walking itself, the sheer, irrational, utterly human decision to leave everything familiar and move toward something enormous and uncertain and perhaps sacred, is what this story, underneath all its violence and politics and consequence, is finally about. People moving through the world carrying what they believed, as people always have, as people always will.